Hey everybody, welcome to Ed on Ed, the show where we dive deep into different myths about eating disorders, looking below the surface and beyond the basic. I'm your host Liz, and I'm ready to learn something new. I hope you are too. It's a humid day here in Austin, Texas, and I'm joined as always by Dr. Ed Tyson. Good morning, Dr. Tyson.
Good morning.
Today we are going to be tackling a capital M myth in America, the myth that fat is bad. And honestly, I think that statement is underplaying it. I think the myth in America is that fat is evil, inherently bad for your health, and morally wrong. I think it's one of America's boogeymen, something to be afraid of, something to avoid, maybe even something to completely exterminate off the face of the earth. What do you think about this statement that fat is bad?
Or as I say, fat is a four-letter word. It's causing a lot of problems, health-wise, emotional health, satisfaction with oneself, and we certainly don't need more of that in our lives. People who hear this at an early age, when they're developing their sense of self, and what they see is people who talk about dieting with the emphasis on you've got to lose fat. Fat is bad. Fat in food is bad. Fat on your body is bad. Fat on other people's body is bad. Look, over there. See, that's fat. That's not what I want you to be.
A lot of people can relate to that, to hearing that message from a very young age, almost to the point that you can grow up and think it's always been that way. People have always perceived fat as something that's bad for your health, when actually, if we look back at history, it's something more or less fairly recent that has come to pass. I actually did some research back into this because I love learning about the history of things. It helps me understand them better. And an article I found really useful was How the Ideology of Low Fat Conquered America. It's from the Journal of the History of Medicine and Allied Sciences by Anne F. LaBerge. And I'm going to read you a quote she has to discuss this myth of fat being bad and how it goes through every level of American society. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about it afterwards.
Great.
So LaBerge writes, I use the term ideology because I came to see low fat as an overarching belief that captured the minds and hearts of the American medical and diet culture in the 1980s and 1990s, supported by scientific studies, promoted by the federal government, the food industry, and the popular media. Low fat became the dominant dietary belief of healthcare practitioners, health popularizers, and a substantial part of the American populace. What comes up for you when you hear that?
I think it was a big sales job. Why would all of a sudden we have this need that everybody has to be low fat? Or, let's be honest, non-fat.
I really think it's going to continue to keep coming up, this shift from a low-fat belief or limiting or decreasing fat to fat-free, and how these trends or these recommendations become more and more severe over time. But you're right, there is a reason why this happened. It actually started in the 1950s. People started realizing that America had a problem with heart disease, and they started looking for a reason why, started looking for a cause. And a hypothesis emerged. It was called the diet heart hypothesis or the lipid hypothesis. All right, I'm about to geek out on some science and history here. So the diet heart hypothesis is something that most people take as fact, but actually is still pretty much an unproven hypothesis that heart disease is caused by ingesting saturated fats and cholesterol, that those build up in your arteries leading to atherosclerosis, which leads to heart disease. And one man had that hypothesis named Ancel Keys and decided to do a study about it called the 7 Countries Study.
The facts are simple. You know the chief killer of Americans is cardiovascular disease, disorders and degeneration of the heart and blood vessels. Here are vital statistics. They show that this problem here in America is the worst in the world.
But there was a little bit of a problem. His study maybe didn't follow all of the scientific method rules we would learn when we were in school. You're supposed to start with a hypothesis and then let the evidence speak to you. It might disprove your hypothesis. But he kind of cherry-picked evidence that he knew would prove his hypothesis correct. He chose 7 countries in 1955 to begin the study: the US, Netherlands, Greece, Japan, Finland, Yugoslavia, and Italy, who all already had high saturated fat diets and high instances of heart disease. But he left out some other countries that might have disproven him, or at least complicated the hypothesis, like France, who had a high animal fat diet but low incidence of heart disease, or Chile, who had a low fat diet but a high incidence of heart disease. I'm going to ask you to make a little guess. In 1961, this study has been published. Guess who scores a position at the American Heart Association?
Ansel Keys?
It's Ansel Keys. And the American Heart Association, I don't think was trying to do anything wrong. I really think they looked at the evidence he found, saw a connection between fat and heart disease, and wanted to help people. So they started making recommendations, decrease the amount of saturated fat and cholesterol that Americans are eating, and it will help their hearts. I mean, you still see that today. Like you're saying, little kids, moms, anyone who's shopping in the grocery store might see the American Heart Association. It's like a little heart with a check mark, and those will be on foods that are lower fat because of this recommendation by this guy who maybe missed some of the data that was out there.
Yes. Now, Ansel Keys is an interesting figure. He actually has more history to them that's actually relevant to eating disorder. To give you a little bit more about him, he's the first person to ever do any research in nutrition at all. First one. So even though his efforts in this were probably way ahead of everybody else, that may have limitations to it, but he developed what were called K rations for the military.
Was it K because of keys?
Keys, correct. And K rations, for those who don't know, were what was the first time that GIs, if you will, the military, could be way out somewhere and take with them meals that were in cans and stored and in a box. And you would open them. When I was in the National Guard, we had K rations still stuck around from the 40s. In addition, because the world had seen so much starvation, unbeknownst to everybody in the past, but massive starvation around the world from not only concentration camps and POW camps, but just because there wasn't food around because of the wars, he decided to do a study called the Minnesota Starvation Study.
I think we might have a full episode on that in the future.
Yes.
I do know about that study, but I had never made the connection that it was the same man.
The same one.
And I'll never, who am I to determine what his intentions were? They sound like they were good and like he was trying to solve a problem. And I think the AHA was trying to solve a problem. But we live in the future and we see some of the outcomes of these recommendations. Because, and I'm surprised by this, Americans actually did follow these recommendations. We eat much less butter, much less lard, much more oils and things like margarine now. We did, as a whole, really start to substitute some of those saturated fats for other types of fats. So it should have worked. We should have lower heart disease rates now. And it's true that fewer people die of heart disease, but that's because of medical innovations that save people who are having a heart attack, and medications that can help treat them. But actually, our rates of heart disease are not lower. Obesity rates are actually higher now than ever. So this diet heart hypothesis kind of is being proven wrong in America, yet the recommendations still stand.
I remember when margarine came out as a kid. I remember thinking it's not as good, but it's supposedly going to be better for you. And so we started having it at the house. So one thing led to another. And as a result, you get more and more of a, if you will, a diet culture or diet attitude, or we've got to lose weight, or what we're eating is wrong, and so on and so on.
And there are people out there now who are trying to do new research. I mean, the CDC right now is working on publishing a study that being slightly overweight as an adult can actually have positive health outcomes. So I do think in the future, as scientists continue to do more research, we'll see a change. But the fact that it's in our culture and seemingly supported by science and the federal government's recommendations can make a lot of people think that it's a truth, that we should be avoiding fat. And it's going to take a lot to change people's minds. And I don't think we're going to change everyone's mind with this episode, but if we can just put a little crack, a little fissure in that foundation of this myth, I think we'll be a success. So let's start with just some basic medical facts that I don't think people understand. Why do we eat fat?
Well, we certainly need fat. It's a source of energy. It has a little over 2 times the amount of calories per volume compared to protein or carbohydrate, which are the 3 major food parts that we call macronutrients. And fat is needed to run things. You have to have heat. Chemical reactions in the body are how things get done. For a muscle to twitch, for a nerve to fire, or whatever, there's energy involved. And you have to have calories to do that. So fat is needed to run the equipment, to keep the lights on, and allow the body to stay where it is.
I think it's really interesting that you talk about heat, because that's what calories are a measure of, right? Is Correct. The heat that something would give off if burned.
I think the definition is 1 calorie is the amount of heat it takes to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water 1 degree centigrade.
I think really taking a moment to step back and unlearn or relearn some of these words that have taken on such baggage in America, things like calorie, and thinking of them as a measure of the heat I need to run my body, and that fat has a higher amount of energy stored within it. So there are times when you need it in order to actually run your body. Are there any body systems in particular that are affected when you don't have enough fat in your diet or in your body?
Everything can be affected by it. Your brain, curiously, what a big important thing that fat does is there are neurons, the nerve cells, and some have a coating. Now, a nerve has a cell body and has a tail. And information from other nerves comes in and gets transmitted down the tail. Then other nerves pick it up. There is a material called myelin that coats the tail of a neuron in certain brain cells, white matter. And that increases the efficiency of a neuron up to 10,000-fold, and that's made of fat. One of the first things we see that happens in brains of people who are malnourished, they start to lose myelin, and their brain does not work as well as it should.
That's really interesting. It's another place where I think people can start to change their mindset, is imagining, oh, this fat is going into my brain. I don't think a lot of people think about fat being a part of the brain. And I think we can all relate to that feeling of, I haven't had lunch yet, I'm getting cranky, I'm not thinking as clearly, and how eating can change that so suddenly. And we can thank our myelin for keeping us going.
Yes, myelin does that. Another interesting aspect about fat is our hormones are based on the cholesterol molecule. And in starvation, one of the first things that happens is people's sex hormone will decrease. In males, testosterone goes down. In females, estrogen goes down. We call it estradiol. This goes back to caveman days. If you had a tribe and there wasn't much food around, if the women got pregnant, they could not only not feed themselves, but the baby, and eventually the tribe would die out. So the wisdom of the body is, let's try to make that not happen. So male and females both will suffer like that. And one of the shocking things when people hear that their sex hormone is undetectable is one of the things that catches people's attention. When I'm trying to convince them, actually this is not good. You do need fat. Fat is good, but what you've been doing is not good. You do need fat.
So one of the risks of not having fat in your diet is it affecting your sexual health, your hormonal health. There's a lot of sports where people are really trying to get to that 0% body fat, where that's the sign that they are fully muscle, fully a performing machine capable of doing everything that needs to be done. I think there's a bit of a fetishization with bodies that have 0% body fat. Think about superheroes needing to look a certain way to look strong. What are the risks of having a low body fat percentage?
There are many. The first thing, of course, is that you lose your sex hormone, like I was just talking about. What's wrong with that? You want to focus on your sport and all that. You don't need to be thinking about sex or whatever. Well, it's more than that. When you start messing with stuff like that, there are complications. It turns out to have healthy bone density, you have to have your sex hormone. I don't care if you're out in the sun, you've got tons of vitamin D and calcium, you've got to have your sex hormone. I see teens, young adults who already have undetectable estrogen or testosterone. If that happens, then we know that they are losing bone density at a rapid rate. During the time of adolescence through the 20s is when women especially will add the most calcium down in their bones that they ever will. If you don't have enough fat on your body, in your diet, and therefore you don't have enough sex hormone or testosterone or estradiol, then you will not make that deposition, for women especially, you won't make that deposition into your bones, and you will develop osteopenia and then osteoporosis.
And most people have probably only heard about osteoporosis affecting the elderly and being something that puts them at risk for fractures from even small falls. This can happen even to young people?
Yes, and there is also a difference between when that happens in young people versus elderly people, because elderly people, their body responds to load-bearing exercise. So people would say, well, isn't it good that I'm exercising so much and that I'm going to get good bone density? If you don't have your sex hormone, exercise can actually worsen your bone density.
So some of these athletes who are reaching this really low body fat percentage might be having muscles that look incredibly strong, but the foundation of the entire body, I remember Miss Frizzle talking about this, is your skeleton. And if the skeleton is weak, the whole system is at risk.
Imagine being a really good athlete and then you get a stress fracture in your foot because your bone density is not good. Or you get one in your tibia, the shin bone, or worse in the larger bones, your back or your hips. To be at an age of, let's say, of 25 or 20 even, I've seen, and have the bones of your great-grandmother, and yet you've got all these years to live, that's frightening.
My mind goes to, and it's possible that these individual cases are not ones where they are malnourished, but I know several gymnasts who broke their back at a very young age, and part of me wonders if it's not only that they were doing high-risk maneuvers, but also that their diet was so fat-free because they needed to stay small to be a gymnast according to current standards, that it put them at a higher risk for breaking their back.
Right. That's absolutely correct. You want to be an athlete and perform, you got to do the sport and you got to work at it. But if you have weak bones, you're going to pay a price.
The defender coming, he's looking for the football. Let's listen in. Big hit, Sanders gets one. And this is what a nail as Jonathan Bostic just separated Mike Willie from...
So we're talking in generalizations. Let's get down to an individual scenario now that can shed some light on this myth. It's powerful to talk about science and to talk about the body in general, but it's even more powerful to know someone's individual story. Who are we going to be learning about today?
We're going to learn about Amy today.
All right, so tell me a bit about Amy.
Well, she's 17 and she makes all A's. In fact, she's never made a B in her entire life. She is also, at this time, looking at colleges for next year, and she's being recruited by a number of the so-called top schools, and they're willing to give her scholarships. And she is also editor of the school newspaper and president of her class and is a pitcher on the softball team.
Sounds like a real slacker.
Yeah, just, come on. Yeah, can't you do more than that? Exactly. She's obviously somebody who thrives doing many things very well. It's very good for her. But last summer, she decided she needed to eat healthier. She began by cutting out snacks, and then over about a month or so, she figured it was better to maybe reduce portion sizes too. She then noticed she had lost some weight, and that was something she thought might be a good thing. She noticed some of her clothes didn't feel as tight, and she liked it. Her weight was down about 7 pounds at that point. Not a lot, but some. She started to eat less and less of some foods. She no longer ate at fast food restaurants, and she didn't like fried foods anymore. There were many foods she didn't like anymore. And over time, it was any food from a fast food restaurant was considered something she would not touch or even get near. Did not want to go to those restaurants. Would not eat if the family wanted to eat there. She would not eat there because she believed that kind of food was not, quote, healthy, unquote.
Do you know anything about what triggered this initial, I want to start eating healthier again? Did she talk about what sparked that initial toe touch into the eating healthy mode?
Always, I ask, do you have any idea why this started when it did? I will tell you, in her case, it was what some people said and then what she heard. And she heard some people say, well, maybe you could be even better at softball if you lost just a little weight. You could run bases faster and, you could work out more and that would come about and so on.
And I mean, just from knowing the little that I know about her already, being this kind of over-the-top perfectionist achiever mentality, I'm sure part of her was like, okay, I'll try that. I'll see if it helps take me to the next level. And it's interesting that it started off in seemingly a place probably a lot of people have been. Okay, I'm going to make some choices that are a little different, see what happens. But it seems like pretty quickly it starts becoming more intense.
Correct. It becomes more and more constrictive in what they allow, more and more restrictive in what they eat and how much they eat and so on. And this is what happens to her. I have heard this kind of story over and over. Everybody's story is unique, and that's important to remember. When anybody comes in, their story is special, but there are many threads that connect them to many others. Like this, athletes, are especially higher level athletes, are at particular risk of this because, well, you need to cut out a little bit, like the 10th of a second running that 50 or swimming that 100-meter butterfly or whatever. And, okay, what do I have to do, coach? What do I have to do? Well, maybe if you weighed less. And you wouldn't have to run, carry that weight around so much.
How did this start affecting her softball performance?
It actually hardly changed at all at first. But later, because this progressed and she declined, it did start to affect her performance. Then the people who were telling her you should be exercising more and losing more were telling her maybe you need to eat more. Maybe you shouldn't exercise so much, leaving her thinking, what's the right thing to do here? I was doing what you wanted. I thought that was it. I thought I was eating healthy. Now you're telling me not to eat healthy. What do you mean by that? Her parents noticed something too, they noticed that she was exercising a little more. She started to jog more. She seemed happy, and so at first they didn't think much of it. And gradually her jogging increased to longer distance, more time, and then the parents started to notice she really restricted, like dinner became a salad, and then it was a salad with only vegetables and never chicken salad or tuna salad. It was just vegetables, and then it was no dressing. And then she stopped milk and cheese and butter. And when she was asked why by her parents, she said, well, that's fat, and everybody knows fat's unhealthy.
Right, and like I'm saying, since she was young, she probably had been receiving that message on multiple fronts.
And she said, Mom and Dad, y'all know that. That's what you said about your diets. So it wasn't long until they realized, boy, she's really going downhill fast. They needed to do something about it. They suggested she go back to eating some of her old foods that she used to really like and did so well, and she absolutely refused. Instead, they found out later she had cut out lunch completely at school, wasn't eating it, and she would only drink water now and nothing else. And then it got to the point where she actually would not touch fat or food that had fat, and wouldn't take a utensil that had been used, perhaps, or a plate or any dish unless it had been in the dishwasher, because she was afraid the fat on the plate would go through her skin and give her too much fat.
What starts as a seemingly rational choice turns pretty quickly into this dangerous, very frightening type of thinking that I think a lot of people would be able to categorize as unhealthy. If you're having that level of thought where you need to wash a plate that might have touched something because it'll go through your skin, that's next level. What is the time scale here? How quickly does she go down this slippery slope?
Well, she took about 4 to 6 months before she was at that degree, but she was already accelerating downward quickly before that.
I think some people would assume that if your body is built to protect itself, that's coded in our DNA, that every decision we make should somehow be serving us. Why, when the body starts realizing it's missing essential things like fat, does it seem to accelerate further downhill? Why isn't her body screaming at her to start eating differently again?
The bizarre thing is that starvation begets more starvation, because they lose their sense of hunger. And then when they eat, they feel really full. And of course, what's the food they hate eating more than anything is fat, because it's got twice the calories, and that's going to make you fat. Fat makes you fat. Not that fat can do anything good for you, it just makes you fat.
Well, let's talk about that, because like we mentioned a little bit earlier, Americans have changed their fat eating practices, but that hasn't led them to be thinner. Where do you think, maybe it's just because it seems logical that if you eat fat, you get fat. Is that how the body works?
No, that's not how it works. The paradox is that we get more and more conscious, but now there are more and more diets. And as there are more and more diets, there's more and more people having trouble and more diets. You may think of the latest rage, and I'm not even going to talk about what it might be, because by the time this comes out, maybe somebody will have another one. They'll say, oh, that was yesterday. That was so last year, So it has not helped. It has not helped. And it's gotten a lot of people in real trouble. Like Amy, she's very desperate and was scared to death of changing her diet at all. She was terrified of it.
Just so we get an answer to the earlier question, okay. Eating fat doesn't cause, there's no direct line, eating fat creates fat. How does the body create fat? What's that process?
Fat is in the diet, of course, if you allow it, and the body uses that for whatever purpose the brain decides. Do we use it for fuel and burn so we can stay warmer, like in the winter? You want to be warmer, you go outside, you might start burning more fat. Or you're exercising more or doing something, you'll burn that, or you're in sustained exercise. So you have to have it in your diet for the body to decide. And it varies in the individual. It's not a group thing where everybody, if you eat fat, here's what it's going to do. It's going to make fat. That's not how it works. So, in fact, one of the interesting things is that when you have a low-fat diet, a very low, like some of my patients, your body will actually start to make cholesterol, synthesize it. And then you'll go to the doctor and they'll check your cholesterol level and it'll be slightly elevated, and they'll tell me you need to cut out fat. And one of my patients, when she was 13, she thought, I don't have any fat. What more can I do? And that was the day she started purging.
It breaks my heart to hear that. And honestly, I'm a little bit angry at a physician who would give that advice to a child. And, this makes me think back to Amy, who in this moment is feeling so frightened and scared. And I think there are a lot of Americans out there who share, at least to some extent, that fear, that have this chronic fear of fat, of not wanting to eat too much, of not wanting to have it on their body, of trying to get rid of it. And I hope that this podcast demystifies some of that fear, because knowledge is a tool that gets rid of fear. Ignorance creates fear, and knowledge is the thing that can finally cast a light and show the truth. To get back to Amy's story, right now, she's in a really delicate situation.
So this was so entrenched that even softball, even schoolwork took a second place to the diet and eating the way. It became an obsession and could not break free of it without her having to get into a program, in this case actually residential program, because she would exercise and she would try to do whatever to not eat. And when faced with the food in front of her at something less than that, she would panic and get furious with her family trying to give it to her. And it really required a higher level of care for that. And the good news is she's at a center where there's others who are going through the same thing, and they start, the ones who used to be and now they're doing better, support her, saying, I used to be like that. It's okay. You'll get through this. You are not going to turn fat. When people come in and say, have I gained a bunch of fat? Am I fat now? Am I fat? And they're desperate for the truth. And I'll say, no. Or she'll tell me, well, gosh, I ate fish for the first time, or I had butter or something like that. And I said, did anything happen to your body? Anything? And I'll say, did you grow an extra buttock? Do you have an extra thigh? And they laugh because they know it's absurd, but they actually had been thinking, I had to gain a bunch of fat from that, and they realized they didn't. And that contrast makes it a little bit lighter for them, and they're willing to accept, okay, yeah, nothing dramatic happened.
Amy's story reminds me of stories people might be a little bit more familiar with, stories about addiction. There's a musician and they have some stage fright, so they always drink a beer before they go out on stage. It helps with their nerves. But then as they get further into an addiction, the beer becomes more important in their life than music. For Amy, she started doing something she thought could help with softball, but at this point, what she's doing means she can't play softball anymore, and it actually hurt her softball career.
And she's not even in school. So both of those were sacrificed. Well, I will put it this way, temporarily, because she will go back and there's no doubt she's going to be an academic success. If she wants to continue with softball, someone like this, of this caliber, when they're truly healthy and balanced in their approach in life and all that.
Definitely. I think once Amy finds that support she needs, she's going to tackle this problem the same way she's tackled all of the stuff that's gone on in her life, with the same verve and passion that she's shown for academics and for sports in the past. Something I really value in your description of the type of treatment she'll be receiving is how eating disorder treatment is similar to addiction treatment, where people who've been through it are there to show you the way, are there to show you that you can get through it too. And that can be make or break when you're in that dark place, to be able to see that kind of example.
And another thing is why I pointed out how smart she was, how driven she was. She has a lot of respect for her brain working right. And when I'm telling her the logic of what happens in the body, and I show her what the lab work says, or why these other things, signs and symptoms and lab tests, EKGs and those kinds of things are showing this, that contrast to the belief about fat is being challenged seriously in her brain. And that is another approach that someone like this really will respond to. It takes a while, but they respond.
Let's make it simple. There are a lot of people out there who have a running commentary in their head. Fat is bad. I need to get rid of it. Fat is bad. If I eat fat, I'm bad too. What are some things they could say to replace those thoughts?
One is that I need enough of it. How do I find balance in my life?
I'm so glad that Amy is getting the support that she needs. Something I would replace those negative thoughts with are, my brain needs fat. Fat is a form of energy, and my body needs energy.
If I want to exercise, why not give it the fuel to do it? Yeah, I mean, it's just food. Doesn't have a personality, doesn't have power. It's just food. It's organic material.
To all the Labyrinth fans out there, you know that when you're faced with a boogeyman, the most powerful thing you can do is tell it, you have no power over me. That's the moment it stops being a boogeyman. And that's the moment when fat starts being just food. Thank you, Dr. Tyson, for shining some truth on today's myth. And thank you, listener, so much for taking the time to learn something new. I hope you take it with you into your day-to-day life and share it with someone else. Till next time, I'm Liz.
And I'm Ed.
And this has been Ed on Ed. Thank you to Tyson Creation for our podcast cover art. You can check out their work at Tyson Creation on Instagram. Thank you as well to In Between Productions for producing and editing this podcast. Check out their work at inbtwnprod.com or at inbetween_productions on Instagram. If you are interested in being an advertising partner or creating original music for the podcast, please reach out to edonedpodcast@gmail.com.